Welcome, everyone. How are we doing on volume in the back? Vince, we good? All right. Welcome, everybody, to the annual Entrepreneurship Conference. My name is Brad Bernthal. I'm an associate professor here at Colorado Law School, and I direct the Entrepreneurship Initiative for our Silicon Flatiron Center. You are in for a treat today, actually probably more of an intellectual feast in terms of my dream lineup. This gets pretty close to it, and excited to have each of you here today to deeply explore the concept of give first. And for those of us who live in or around Boulder, Give First feels like a linchpin of the startup community. Along with mountains and sun, it's one of the attractions that motivates entrepreneurs to migrate to the Front Range. It's a normal behavior about how exchanges work between people in the startup scene. And in my estimation, it facilitates what Brian Eno calls genius, which he defines as the communal form of genius. Yeah, we really don't understand many dimensions of Give First that deeply, and today is a chance to meditate and reflect upon what Give First means and is. Before going further, I want to highlight many people who make today's conference happen. First, Colorado Law School for the courtroom, parking. On the back of your program, I direct you to take a look at the Silicon Flatiron sponsors list and tell them thank you. If you are not a sponsor but you're interested, please talk to our program director, Anna Noscasi, who's back there, or myself at some point. Additionally, members of our Entrepreneurship Initiative Advisory Board, including Jason Mendelson, who has long been our chair there. We also have a confederated group that works together across campus on entrepreneurial matters. I want to thank them who are involved in the Innovation Entrepreneurship Initiative here at CU. And a special thanks to our out-of-town guests who made the trip, including Anna Saxenian from Cal Berkeley, the Dean of the Information School. I don't know if Anna's here yet. If not, she'll be coming here shortly. Brian Brofman from the University of Indiana, and Sonali Shah from University of Illinois. And last but not least, I want to say thank you to the team here at Silicon Flatirons, which is really fabulous. Brian, we just introduced you momentarily. If you want to take a bow again, hi. Silicon Flatirons team, Anna Noscasi is our managing director. Kelly Brown is our marketing director. Vanessa Koppel is outside working. Sarah Schnickren, who runs our student programs. Susanna, and our student volunteers. Please help me in giving a warm thank you to each of them. All right, conference program sets forth today's schedule. You can take a look at that. You'll see that Brad Feld and Anna Saxenian get the last word today. They'll wrap up at 5:30. Then we'll take the conversations literally right across the street where the old law school is. Now the Idea Forge is where we are going to do the reception, which also doubles as a reception for the College of Music, has an entrepreneurship conference tomorrow. And so thanks to Jeff Nitch for making that happen. And special thanks to Elevations Credit Union, which is sponsoring tonight's reception for both Silicon Flatirons and the College of Music. If you see Jeffrey or Ken tonight from Elevations, please give them a hug. We've got tradition when we start our entrepreneurship events. Take a minute, reach out, find someone you've not met before today, introduce yourself, and we'll get going in 1 minute.
I'll come introduce myself.
Good to see you.
How's it going?
I should probably turn the mic off. This is going to be a lot of fun. I'm looking forward to this discussion. Yeah, the more we get into it. Making the trip. Yeah. Nice to meet you. I hope that we can visit during a break in a little bit. Emily, Jody, Emily. Emily is with the edit with the estate, and Jody is an investor who works for
Good show.
You'll be totally welcome. Yeah. Okay. There's always a happy problem to have trouble reconvening people. Although not apparently as much a problem as reattaching my lapel. All right, let's give it one more shot here. Okay, so I'm not an entrepreneur. It is true that I ran an illegal gambling pool in junior high that some of you may or may not have participated in. But I am a lawyer by training, and I generally think of myself as a law-abiding one at that today. I got involved in the entrepreneurial community about 13 years ago, mostly by accident, and it looked very different than what I expected. Many interactions between people within the startup scene took the version of this, which is the Entrepreneurial Law Clinic page, which will come up here momentarily. I took over our Entrepreneurial Law Clinic where attorneys from the area, in fact, attorneys who are constantly bombarded with jokes about lawyer greed, volunteered to supervise our students' work, and they continued to do so today. I noticed customary practices associated with random meetings, where near strangers get together over coffee at the New Tech meetup or through other serendipitous interactions. And I started to take an afternoon at the coffee shop each week to take meetings, both in some to give advice and other meetings to take advice. Continue to do that today. A new institutional form, the Accelerator. Grew up in Boulder. Techstars pooled expert mentors. These mentors voluntarily and freely gave help and continue to do so to portfolio companies in the absence of a formal agreement. And at CU, we launched a platform for anyone across the campus who wants to start a company. And in part inspired by Techstars, we curated our own pool of mentors, many of whom are in here today. And these people turned out to be the secret sauce to success for the New Venture Challenge, which in this year is in its 11th year moving forward. Okay, so each of these examples underscores that a norm of cooperative behavior permeates the startup community. And thriving startup scenes are places where capitalism and competition are interleaved with healthy doses of collaboration and cooperation. We live at a time where some observe a decline in social capital. Yet growing energy within entrepreneurial communities suggests an important and intriguing counterfactual. In fact, there might be something instructive about how trust and cooperation are built and protected in Give First communities. Interactions and exchanges within the community bear some resemblance to peer production. Like Wikipedia or open source software, the startup community exchanges involve many people who help build products and services. This captures the benefits associated with network effects. But it comes with a twist in that this version of peer production, as it relates to startup activities, results in goods that are not necessarily fully accessible or open. Startup communities support companies and entrepreneurs that appear to privately capture many of the benefits associated with production. This always struck me as a really interesting puzzle as to why do people get involved in this way. And then in a guest lecture 5 or 6 years ago, Brad Feld described what we now call Give First. He said that these free and voluntary exchanges in the startup community are not altruism. Rather, they relate to a belief in the network. That is, instead of the direct exchange depicted on the left, in a startup community, we see an exchange where number one gives to number two unilaterally. That is, without an expectation of direct benefit in return. And number one trusts that the network will give back. You don't know in what way, You don't know from whom, you don't know at what time, but you trust that this will work out. And that was a real light bulb moment for me. It had a lot of explanatory power about norms of startup behavior that I was seeing in Boulder. Ultimately, that leads to today, an effort to deepen our understanding of Give First. And in particular, this conference is going to take up 5 questions. The first, what is Give First? And to kick things off, Professor Peppett is going to moderate a discussion between Sam Zell and Brad Feld, in which they will give you their conceptions of what Give First is. And then in the final panel of the day, Sonali Shah is going to circle back to how Give First works and what it looks like in the context of user-generated content as well as within makerspaces. Question number 2, why Give First? What's the case for giving first? And we'll look at this from 3 different perspectives. 1, individuals. 2nd, from a company, why as a company strategy might you want to participate in a good Give First system? And finally, from a regional or network perspective, and on this score, notably, one of our panelists on the first panel, Anno Saxenian, literally wrote the definitive book discussing Silicon Valley's enduring advantage as a geography with respect to startup practices. Question number 3, how does Give First relate to groups and knowledge sharing? And to kick off the first panel, Phil Fernbach here from CU is going to talk about knowledge and groups, and then we will juxtapose that against Give First practices. Question number 4, what about strangers and outsiders? That is, without formal contracts to protect yourself, how within Give First do we police bad behaviors with outsiders that we don't necessarily trust, who don't necessarily know the norms of behavior in a Give First network? Moreover, how do you weave in newcomers to the network? And on our second panel, Brian Brofman is going to highlight that new ideas often come from those people that we barely know, and he has an explanation as to how strangers work into systems that rely upon familiar social norms. Question number 5. Who wins versus who loses in Give First? That is, are there winners, or people who take a disproportionate share of the distributive benefits in the Give First system? And are there doormats, and what separates them in a Give First system? And to the extent that we've got concerns about fairness of how benefits get distributed in a Give First system, what safeguards might be warranted in terms of how we practice Give First in a community? So that's where we're going. I am delighted to have you here. To help get things started, please help me welcome Professor Scott Peppett, Sam Zell, and Brad Feld. Come on down, guys.
I feel like the Wizard of Oz.
Thanks.
All right. So welcome, everyone, and welcome to the 2 of you. Let me just start us by saying I don't know much, but I'm pretty sure neither of you is a doormat. So I think we're covered. Our goal for this first hour is to really have a conversation and really have a conversation between the 2 of you. I will open things up to questions from the audience when we get sort of towards the back end. And as always at all Silicon Flatirons event, the first question from the audience has to be from a student. So if you're a student in the room, you can be thinking of what that question might be. So if you don't know who these people are, you probably shouldn't be here. But there's long descriptions in the pamphlet, so we weren't going to do long introductions. I will say the 2 of you, I know Sam better than I know you, Brad, but I've known you both for quite a long time. You're both iconoclastic, a little eccentric. You play at very different parts of the capital world, but you also have a lot of things in common. So we just discovered that you've seen his art collection, and you were both at MIT last week at the same conference. They just didn't cross paths. So you're orbiting, and it's nice to have you both here with us. So let's just start. Brad, I wanted to start with you and just start with this idea that Brad was the other Brad was just describing of Give First and what this means, right? So how do you think about this? How do you distinguish it from altruism? What are we talking about?
And I wasn't at the conference. I just talked to the guy who was running
Oh,
the
okay.
conference. But it's close enough. So Give First for me first emerged, the construct of it first emerged in a tangible way when I wrote Startup Communities, the book Startup Communities in 2012. And I had a very little short section in it called Give Before You Get. And I was trying to capture the dynamic of what was happening in sort of Techstars around mentorship with that maybe one or two paragraphs. And Techstars, we kept talking about it, Techstars grabbed it, and eventually sort of liked the idea and turned it into this hashtag Give First as a mantra. And I distinguished it very specifically from the idea of pay it forward. Mm-hmm. And I think pay it forward is a construct that many of us are familiar with, many of us have benefited from. Probably some people in this room are regularly paying it forward, where somebody, when earlier in your career experience, did something for you as a mentor, or as, if Phil Weiser was here, he would say as a rabbi, and helped you in a way that was very much one-directional. And you now, sort of later on in your career, are doing that for others. And it's a very powerful construct, but I was seeing something different happen. And it was basically a cousin, right? So it wasn't so much that people were doing it out of this notion of somebody had done it for me and now I need to do it for somebody else, hence pay it forward. It was more of this idea of, I'm going to put energy into this system. Mm-hmm. I don't know what I'm going to get back, but I'm willing to put some energy into the system. However, it's not altruistic behavior. I expect to get something back. I just don't know when, from whom, over what time frame, in what consideration, right? Like the thing that's coming back to me is not being defined up front. And as I evolved it, the language we started using at Techstars and I started using more broadly was it's essentially the best version of a non-transactional relationship. Like so many of the relationships that we have in business and frankly in life, right? You negotiate the terms of the relationship before you enter into the relationship. Mm-hmm. Many obvious examples of it. But there's a lot of things that we do as human beings where we're willing to do things without defining transactionally what's going to happen. Mm-hmm. And we usually do it with people that we trust, right? People that we already have deep relationships with or comfort with. What if you took that construct and applied it to a dynamic system? And for me, the dynamic system that was interesting was a startup community, and the experimental place to play around with that was in Boulder. When I say it's not altruistic, it doesn't mean it can't be philanthropic, right? So I'm using the word altruistic very specifically because altruistic generally is selfless, where you expect nothing back. And even with philanthropic, you're generally expecting something back. Mm-hmm. It might be a direct reward. You sponsor a bathroom at CU, and you expect that there'll be a plaque on the wall where the bathroom is. You might put your name on a building. You might put money into a program that you expect is going to behave a certain way or do a certain set of things. Or it doesn't have to be that well defined. You could put money into something philanthropically because you want to support it. Mm-hmm. And you get from that activity and from the support of that reinforcement of your value system or things that play out, right? So there's a lot of ways to do it, but this notion that there has to be on the return side an expectation. Mm-hmm. The problem if there isn't one is the doormat problem. Mm-hmm. Is that over time you start feeling like I'm putting all this energy into this thing and I'm never getting anything back.
Nothing's coming out.
So that's where Give First came from. And I would say it's still a construct, at least in my mind, that's evolving very meaningfully. I have a book coming out next year called Give First that a number of people have contributed to the thinking on, and I think this is really, I was touched when Brad said he wanted to do this because this is a great way for me to hear how other people think about it, and especially problems with it, mm-hmm. Because there are a lot of fundamental problems with it too.
How do you think about this, Sam?
Well, I have a very different perspective. Brad is part of the, you keep referring to it as the startup community or the venture community. And what I've done is created an empire, which covers a lot of different disciplines. And maybe the best way to explain it is that I'm the source of capital for 35 people who work for me. And they are my startup people. They are my venture capitalists. And my job is to create a community that's incentivized, where there's interdependence, and yet at the same time, I have no interest in doing Abe Lincoln's A Team of Rivals. My thesis is the enemy is without, and my job is to make sure that the internal support system, it cross-supports everybody else. And so his give first is, you got a community here and we're going to make it into a mutually dependent and supportive organization. And I did the same thing, but within an organization where I'm the only beneficiary, or I and a few of my investors. But the basic premise is the same, and that is that everybody needs to contribute and connect to each other to make 1 + 1 = 3 or 6.
And I mean, to what extent are we talking about setting a norm of long-term cooperative behavior, right? So to a certain extent, when I hear you talk about, okay, somebody, Techstars is an easy context to think about this, but somebody comes into this ecosystem, into this community, or into your world, your universe of whether it's inside your company or all the people who are in orbit around your companies, and you're saying to them, look, don't be a taker, right? Don't show up and say, what's in this for me right now transactionally. Contribute, and you're kind of setting that as the norm, right? And if you, now we can talk about what happens when somebody doesn't play that way, right? Somebody shows up who isn't like that. But I mean, to what extent is that what you're trying to do? And you both do that, right? You're both long-term.
Yeah, but we're both basically, I mean, if you sat on my shoulder all day long, one of the things you would hear the most is, are we getting paid for the risk? So in effect, I'm really asking, again, within a closed community or a more open one that you have here, still the same question. Is it risk related? And are you making everything risk adjusted? Because if you don't, the price is all hell to pay.
I think that the label I would give this construct, wherever it is applied, whether it's applied within an organization, across organizations, in a small geographic place like Boulder, or across an entire ecosystem that's separate from geography, I think the language I would use is a cultural norm. So you're using a cultural norm not to establish behavior, because cultural norms don't establish behavior. They establish sort of a base that you then evolve from. And what I mean by that, I'll use Techstars as an example, right? When Techstars started here 12 years ago, it was an idea that got bounced around and funded by 4 people, where the first program had about 30 entrepreneurs involved, 10 companies, 50 mentors, most of whom, I or some subset of us knew. That was a constrained amount of time, 3 months, where our downside case, right, because the amount of money, back to risk reward, the amount of money that first program required was $230,000 to run the program and invest in all the companies. And my investment was $50,000. I've wasted way more than $50,000 on much stupider things, right? So my sort of risk reward assessment was easy. My downside case, like my worst case, if the thing was a total failure economically, was that I'd make some new friends, right? And I'd run an experiment and it'd be stimulating. And that was worth it in the downside case. Wind the clock forward 12 years. Techstars today, the organization is 250 people. It's a very sizable operating business. So the economic business is successful. They've now funded 1,500 companies, many of which are active. They've had companies go from the accelerator now to being a public company, SendGrid being the local one that's a good example. They have about 10,000 mentors involved in Techstars programs around the world. Next year, they'll do 50 programs, so we'll fund 500 companies around the world next year in these programs. We have relationships with about 40 major corporations, Fortune 1000 class organizations. So there's this integration of what these entrepreneurs are doing into the corporate innovation ecosystem. The companies themselves, I mean, the metric of how much money you've raised is not an economic value measure, but it is a validation of relevance measure. I think the 1,500 companies have raised a total of $6 billion, something around that. And the current market cap of the cumulative companies that are still active, so not the ones that have exited but still active, is something between $15 and $20 billion. So if you look at that,
That's a good upside.
right, reasonably good economic potential. The underlying framework,
Right.
cultural norm, is this idea across the whole system, not just the mentors, right? Not just investors, not just the founders of the companies, both within and around, is this cultural norm that we've defined as give first, where we're essentially saying put energy in, you'll get rewards. And I would challenge you, there's probably a few people across, oh, by the way, if you look at Startup Weekend, right, it touches 100,000 people a year all around the world. Add up all these people, a couple 100,000 people a year around entrepreneurship that are touched by Techstars directly. I'm sure there's some people that say, I'm not getting from this what I'm putting into it. But my guess is that that's a very small fraction, right? The vast majority of people will subscribe to that cultural norm, and that continues to build on it because in the same way it could impact Boulder as a small startup community, that cultural norm across the landscape of startups worldwide it has turned out to be very, I think, both transformative and empowering for a lot of, especially first-time entrepreneurs.
Mm-hmm. How do you, so how do you both think about when you're dealing with people, whether it's in Techstars or it's in your work at Foundry or whether you're wherever you are, how do you think about dealing with people who take advantage of this norm, right, or take advantage of this way of doing business? So, you Sam, in your book, you talk about, you talk about a guy who says, hey, no one ever likes to do a second deal with me. And you kind of laugh in the book and say, it's just so cliche at this point for somebody to even say that to me, but that's also not who I want to transact with, right? I'm not interested in the sharks that are circling around. I'm interested in long-term players who want to, do well together, and if they can play like that, fine, and if they can't, then ... what happens, right? So how do you deal with that in your respective worlds?
Well, at least from my perspective, I start with the assumption that everybody leads to 1 + 1 = something. And where they do, that means I'm going to do more transactions with them, whether it be in the capital markets where I'm a big capital consumer, and every time I sell equity or sell debt or variations, I'm always thinking about the next deal and making sure that the deal I'm doing won't poison the well for the next deal. And I think I look at that in terms of everybody. I look at them in terms of giving somebody a small challenge in the hopes that I'll see something there that will allow me to, in fact, trust them more and increase my exposure.
Mm-hmm. And what happens when somebody, lawyer, banker, investor, LP, whatever, employee, doesn't matter, partner, whatever, takes advantage of that kind of collaborative community that you've built around you? How does that go? I mean, neither of you is a pushover. So I'm assuming that you and the people around you are policing this norm. There's got to be ways in which you're cutting out people who don't play well.
Yeah. So
Well, I was just going to say that the culture you create, whether it be internal in my case or external in his case, is very judgmental. you don't perform or you're not a team player, it becomes very obvious very quickly. And they get axed. In your case, it might be the definition. In my case, the definition of axed is they don't have a job anymore. In your case, it's excess.
Yeah, I think I want to. I was reacting quickly to something you said, Scott, which is I don't believe that I police the cultural norm, nor do I believe that.
But that's because it's also not all your money.
Well, no, even if it was all my money, I don't think that it's policing the dynamic around the behavior, because I think in dynamic systems generally, if you have the significant majority of the system subscribing to a cultural norm, the system itself oftentimes will eliminate the problem. Then when you translate it to a personal level, and I have lots and lots of business interactions, whether they're at with my partners at Foundry, or they're with through other random things in the world, or through Techstars or anything else. I've subscribed for a long time, and I think it's actually the same thing that Sam said, but again, a slight twist. I'm very optimistic when I enter into a relationship with anyone. So I'm sort of open to a relationship with anyone.
You have to be.
Right?
Yeah.
What would be the point of not? And I don't really care what their background is, where they come from, what they look like, what their experience is, what their gender is, what their educational background, whatever it is. I'm open to any of those things. And I talk about this a lot. I'm sure people have heard the story of random days and how Techstars literally started because of a random meeting that I took, and continuing to let that be part of my own value system. I like to layer on top of that something that I call the screw me once rule. And so I'm basically fine with getting fucked over one time. And it's my job when that happens, when I feel that, to bring it up. And I might be wrong, by the way. I might have been the one that was the problem in the situation versus the other person, or I might have contributed to it. But when I feel that way, it's my responsibility in a relationship to bring it up. And I have found that almost always the other person is at least responsive to a conversation around, because so much of our lives, when people do things that hurt other people, they never bring them up, they never talk about them, they never resolve them, they just sit. So it's not a fearlessness, it's just again, a value system. The second time the same kind of thing happens from that person, then I'm done. And so it's more of this sort of idea of trying to build and evolve the individual relationships, knowing that I'm going to make a lot of mistakes. And the difference between people is, when you make a mistake, do you own it and do you try to do something with it, or do you try to push it off on somebody else, you try to hide it? Within an organization, you manage that by firing people. Across organizations, it's much harder to do that. And so access is a piece of it. But you can also decide sort of, am I the one that's going to determine access to Boulder? Somebody screws me over and I make sure that they're not, you're dead to this town?
But the answer is that if I were looking to invest in Boulder, I would have a short list of people to call and say,
what do you think of this person?
Harry is pitching me. What do you think of this?
That's right. So the reputational effect of that person damaging it.
But that's called access.
Right. And I think my philosophy around that is the system solves for that. Because it's not that everybody that's looking to invest in Boulder has to call me. Right. But the reputational effect of people who are bad behaviors in the context of a cultural norm will surface.
But I would take your example and translate it to the real estate business, where I've had a little bit of an experience. And what's amazing is that, you're missing one part of this conversation, which is greed. I've seen guys do deals and who have terrible reputations, but are able to, recruit capital and support because they, sold greed. So I think that's the other side of that.
People couldn't help themselves.
Yeah, they just yell. Well, it's like the guy who looked at me and said, I take great pride in the fact that nobody's ever wanted to do a second deal with me. And I said, well, not me. I'm going to be the first one that's going to want to do a second deal with him. He was right, of course.
That's great.
Absolutely.
Right. So there's a proviso on give first, right? Which is give first, and this isn't a free ride,
Yeah,
right?
but
if people
give first is another way of saying take risk. That's exactly what it is. It's take risk. It's stick your hand out. You might get chopped off or might get hurt in the process. But if you want to, quote, have an impact, you got to take the risk.
Right.
You got to buy a ticket.
You both used a word in the last 2 paragraphs of this conversation, which was trust. How does this connect to establishing trust, preserving, fostering, building trust? Whether, again, I mean, it's true inside your company, but you also have this huge universe of players that are, an ecosystem unto themselves. How does that get built, and to what extent is that what we're
Trust
talking
is
about?
history. Trust is history. Trust is, I took a little bit of a risk with Sam last time and it worked out, so now I'll take a little more. I, believed in his recommendation and turned out to be appropriate. Might have been unsuccessful, but the logic behind it, was, something I could rely on.
I would add to it and just say it's a posture. It's a posture that you take. You think about all the business interactions you have where you know that the person that you're starting to interact is coming from a posture that's not trusting, right? It's a posture where they're concerned about the downside more than they're looking at where things could go. And if you link that language to give first, it's not trust unambiguously with no concern for yourself, with no concern for where the outcome could be. It start with a posture that extends trust and allows things to start to build. And then to Sam's point, history, reputation starts to create this very powerful circle where if you looked at Brad's first thing, where I hadn't seen that picture before, but it's a relationship between two people. I have a relationship with you, you have a relationship with me, we have an exchange. Okay, that's one type of trust that develops. But how about the trust where, you trust Scott, Scott trusts me. By definition,
We
you
do that
start-
stuff all the time.
That's right, and that's the power, especially when you can extend it to more and more people, right? When that becomes the norm of the starting point, people in that system will violate the trust, things will go wrong, and interestingly, when things...
There's a big difference between things going wrong and a violation of the trust.
Agreed.
Okay? In other words, that's hugely relevant in this whole conversation because everybody got to start with an understanding that X% is going to go wrong.
Yep.
And it doesn't matter whether you're 5'10" or 10'5" or whatever, there's a certain percentage, it's going to go wrong. And the real job of an entrepreneur is to attack up front what the potentials for it going wrong and mitigating what the most negative result might be.
Yeah, I have some difference with the last thing that you said. I agree with everything up to that point.
I figured you would because you're a venture capitalist and I'm an investor. Am I being too subtle? I mean, I could talk slower.
That's good, that's good. I was with
I mean, guys like you live with binary results all the time.
Yeah.
I don't do binary results.
Binary
I have
or minor?
binary, meaning either we win or it's zero.
Yeah.
I end up with some of them periodically. They're not fun, but you guys, when you invest in a much earlier stage in the evolution of businesses, there's a binary acceptance that's much different than someone who invests at a much later stage in the
Yeah, I
evolution.
accept that, absolutely. I think the thing that I was...
There's less upside, but less downside, or there should be.
The thing that I disagreed with you on is simple, is the path that I was going down and linking trust to failure is way more things on the path to a successful business, in my experience, don't work than do work. And what happens is that if you can start to separate the idea of trusting someone from whether or not the specific instance of the thing that your experience is working or not working, when you start to extend that over a long period of time, you can get something really interesting out of it. So my guess is in how that relates is we think of the experience, or I think of the experience with an entrepreneur as potentially many companies over the course of their lifetime, some that might work and some that won't. And within a company, I look at it as a whole bunch of experiments early on trying to find things that work, knowing that more things are not going to work than work. Later on, when you have an established business, you're actually trying to look for, I won't put words in your mouth, because I apparently don't care about anything but binary outcomes. As it gets later, you have a base thing that's working that you continue to build off while you're then looking for those new incremental things. The point I was getting to was that the idea of trust and the idea of success or failure are completely independent of, completely disconnected from each other. If there's somebody that I don't trust that's being successful, I don't give a shit, I want nothing to do with them. If there's somebody who I trust who's failing at something or having something that's not working, I'm happy to engage and try to be helpful, even if I don't have an economic stake. Right? So those two things are the difference in that cycle. And when you start to put that against the backdrop of a bunch of things, I mean, I think you've had a couple of failures. I've had an awful lot of failures. Those failures are actually, if you look at it from the side, they're experiences where you learn something about the thing, the people you dealt with, and yourself. And if there's trust in the cycle between the people that you dealt with and yourself, you can actually do something even better the next time around, or have the potential to do something better the next time around. My guess is the guy you hated doing business with, that you thought you'd do it twice and he did it once, you know, after once you didn't trust him. It's like, what's the point? This is no point.
Life's too short.
Yeah.
So you're both repeat players. You're both in the markets over and over and over for capital, for talent, for all kinds of stuff, right? So you're basically saying, look, this person, as long as I'm invested, I trust this person. They fail once, they fail twice even. I'm assuming there's 3, 4, 5, 6, you know, there's a long future that good things might happen.
But let me make one distinction.
Yeah.
Anybody that I, in effect, back, if he doesn't make it, then the definition of success or the responsibility is as much mine as his, if he's been straight. In other words, it's very important that the person in my position or your position has to accept responsibility for whatever he does.
I take a step further too, is from a venture capital perspective, we take equivalent responsibility for the failure of a company. What you just said. What we try really hard not to do culturally at Foundry, and I think also at Techstars, is take equivalent responsibility for the success of the company. We like to think that the success of the company is attributed to the entrepreneurs, not to us. We play a supporting role. If we helped in that success, awesome. At the minimum, I hope we didn't hinder the potential for the success. But when something fails, it's us.
I've said this to you before, but I've noticed in your world, when things go right, it's the team. When things go wrong, well, that was Sam.
Right.
You know, there's a truth to that, though, right?
There is. I mean, that's Harry Truman. This is where the buck stops.
Right.
Yeah, I'm very comfortable taking the responsibility of everybody else's failure.
Yeah.
They get attributed to me anyway, so why not?
Right.
It's just easier. It cuts down on the conversations.
So, Brad, the other Brad, Bernthal, at the beginning, said something about the distribution of benefits under a system like this, right? In an ecosystem where people are trying to contribute up front, they're trying to look long term, they're trying to develop collaboration, all the stuff we've been talking about. You know, talk a little bit about the distribution of benefits, and you called it benefits and somethings, drawbacks or doormats or winners and something. Anyway, winners and doormats. Yeah, I mean, how, and I'm not sure I have a good intuition, and Brad, you might, but how are there drawbacks to give first? Who is this, as you put it, sort of, who's this hurting, or who are the losers in a system like this? And I don't have an intuition.
Here's an example of a pattern that results in a person being a loser with good intentions, right?
Okay.
Where the philosophy that is evolving doesn't benefit them. Here's a very specific example. It's the person who shows up and says, I'm going to become very involved in the startup community, and I'm going to give first, and I'm going to put a lot of energy into giving first into the startup community. I don't know what's going to come back over what period of time, et cetera. And they then allocate 80% of their time to that activity and 20% of the time to the business that they're starting.
Got it.
And 3 years later, they're broke and they're frustrated and things aren't coming back to them and they're bitter and they're annoyed with everybody because they're not being appreciated for everything they're doing.
Right.
And the reason is that they misinterpreted the dynamic, which is not that you should, they were essentially looking for a job being that.
In the network.
Versus being an entrepreneur and participating in the network through that philosophy.
Right.
So that would be an example of where it breaks down.
Yep.
Here's another example. If I showed up at Bill's office and said, and I met Bill for the first time, so Bill didn't know me and I didn't know Bill, and we were just meeting. That's Bill, by the way. And I got introduced to Bill by somebody that we knew mutually, and I'm earnest and I want to be helpful. And I show up and I say, how can I give first to you? Right? I just gave Bill an assignment. And I just shifted the responsibility and the burden of figuring out what to do to Bill. Mm-hmm. For those of you that have a life partner, when your life partner is struggling with something and you're sitting around, I learned this from my wife Amy, and Amy's sitting there and she's struggling with something. I say, how can I help? And she says, fuck you. and I say, well, what did I do wrong? She says, I already have a problem. I don't want to have to figure out what you can do to help me with my problem.
Right.
Right, so that's another example of how it breaks down.
I like Amy already. Right. Fair enough. So, all right, let's talk two more things before we take questions. One is, my guess is this sort of connects to who you both are as people, right? So to a certain extent, you're both enormously successful in lots of different ways, including financially. I don't think either of you wakes up every morning and thinks to yourself, what I'm trying to do today is earn another dollar, right? I don't think that's what drives you. I don't think that's why you do what you do. I don't think that's why you're working as hard as you're working, because you want the pile of money to get bigger. Just doesn't seem like that from what I know about you. So to what extent is this kind of collaborative, long-term MO just aligned with your values, right? It's just how you like to do business. Look, we all know people out there in the world who like to do business the other way, whether they're the proverbial car salesman, right? Who like to take advantage. I teach negotiation for a living, right? There's a certain number of my students who would love to be sitting here and hearing a business community saying it can be like this. And there's a certain little subset of my students who really just want to screw the other guy, right? That's what they like to do. It's not very many, but it's a few, right? They don't always succeed, especially if they're up against smart players, but that's kind of baked into their DNA.
Spend time with Mendelssohn.
Yeah. Sorry, Jason.
Just to train them better.
Yeah, that's right.
Not in that, but like teach them that they can't actually win.
Yeah, right. I mean, and that's their mindset, right? There's a certain number who at least start there. It seems to me like this attitude, this norm that we're talking about, is just more comfortable. It fits with how you are in the world.
Aren't we really talking about validation? In other words, the answer is that, there was a great movie once called Cash McCall, and there's a scene there where he's getting a massage, and he's explaining to the masseuse that, here he is on a private plane getting a massage, and he says, look, it's really simple. Money is a way of keeping score. And more than anything else, once you earn enough to live comfortably, I don't know that I don't know about Brad, but I don't know that money is the motivation. Money is freedom. Money is the ability to give it away. Money is the ability to use it to influence other people. And it happens to be the measure of our society. But the driving force has to be validation. what's better than some guy comes and pitches you on an idea and you think it's a good idea and you invest in it and it turns out to work? That's validation. Done in a startup, done in a distressed situation, you're making a judgment, and then you get a chance to find out if you're right or wrong. And how well you do that is the ultimate measure of what you are and what you're achieving.
I like that. I would say I'm 52, and sort of my evolution from when I started my first company when I was 19 and right on the edge of 20. I've always been sort of searching for a way to coherently put together the way that I think about stuff. And that's evolved as I've had more experiences and grown and had successes and had failures. And some of you may have heard this particular story, so I won't share the whole story, but like, for example, in my first company, we eventually came up with a motto. That was what we did as a company, which our motto was, "We suck less." And it ended up being a very, very helpful and instructive way for us to think about what we were doing. And our customers loved it because it helped them understand who we were in the context of their world in a way that allowed us to be effective as what our business was. When I sold that first business, the guy that bought it was a guy named Len Fassler, who's the person that really had the most influence. I was 28, had the most influence on my thinking at that time and continually over the years. Len's 88 and still a very, very, very close friend. And what I observed in the first year of working with Len, I'd never bought or sold a company, I'd never done an investment, I just run this self-funded business, and all of a sudden I'm part of an organization that's doing lots of acquisitions, and I'm the technical guy in the deal team, and I'm hanging out with Len and his partner Jerry Pock and all of these entrepreneurs and founders of companies that they were buying, including some ones that were much, much larger than mine. And I saw the negotiation, and I saw the businesses, and I learned a lot about different kinds of businesses and how people operated. But what I saw consistently was that Len was evaluating they were evaluating the businesses financially, but Len was spending a lot of his time evaluating the people. And in a lot of cases, they decided to do things where the surface layer of the business evaluation was maybe not as good as you might thought it would be, but the character of the people were really good. And then the inverse was true too. The businesses looked like great fucking businesses, but the people did not look so good. And they mispriced a few acquisitions here and there, but not too bad. But generally speaking, Len's view of the people, not in the absence of the business data, made such an impression on me. And 30 years later, or 25 years later, whatever the number is, the number of people in my business orbit that were somehow connected to me, to Len, is still a very large number. And that's something that I've continued to search for. With my first venture firm I was part of, my foundry partners worked with us we all worked together at Mobius. I have very little interaction other than with a few people at Mobius, other than my partners at Foundry, but we've now had a 20-something year relationship together, a 19-year relationship together as partners. And so I look at that and I say, okay, fundamentally, I can see how that works in a constrained set. Is there a way to apply this to a larger surface area in business? And I'm not going to say in society because I feel like that's presumptive for me to go in that direction in terms of my own experience and my own interest, by the way. And then it links, I think, really back to this sort of notion of validation, right? I mean, I'll expire, I'll vanish from this planet at some point, and when I die, nobody will give a shit, and it'll be over, right? My dad likes to say, they dig a hole in the ground, they put you in it. I like to say, Dad, they're going to put me in a little box, and they're going to shove me through some fire, and then I'll be in a little box, because I don't want to waste all that space in the ground. I said, but it keeps going, so I'm less worried about that moment, and I'm more worried about what I can do and what I can figure out and how I can impact people and how they can impact me now while I'm here.
All right, in the interest of time, I was going to ask you about the economy, but I'll let somebody else do that. So in the interest of time, I'm going to go to questions. Student? Yeah. Go. I think we have microphones, running around.
The economy, the answer is really easy. We're at the bottom of the cycle. Assets are really cheap right now. Load up on debt because cost.
I better get my feet off the ground.
Yeah. And have I got something to sell? If anybody's a buyer, I got something to sell you.
Yeah.
Hi, Vince. I'm a second-year law student. I was curious that once these communities and norms are really established, not so much who is harmed by them, but what you see as most threatening to the norms as a whole.
I don't know. I don't have a precise answer.
Hubris.
Well, hubris is threatening to kind of everything that's successful. If you use a geographic constraint like Boulder, I think, and use startup community as the thing that you're applying it to, I think the Boulder startup community is incredibly healthy today. I think it's been on a very healthy path. But you start looking at things that are problems, right? The dynamic between the startups and the entrepreneurial community in Boulder and the city of Boulder, which for the first wave of it were parallel universes. All of a sudden, there's starting to be activity by the city or other people in the community that don't like this. And they don't like it because of something that's changed or something that threatens them. And so then you have these exogenous forces that are really just part of the dynamic system. So it's incumbent on people in the startup community to not fall into the trap, whether it's hubris or whether it's this is the way it should be or those stupid people over there don't understand, but continue to work on the evolution. So maybe my linkage to my build on hubris is it's this idea of stagnation. Like when you have something that's working, it's dynamic. It has to keep evolving and changing, and you have to keep running experiments and trying things and having stuff not work and learning from it. And ultimately, if you subscribe to the startup community philosophy, being inclusive, like continuing, even people that disagree with you, people that annoy you, people that argue with you, people who have different perspectives from you, being willing to listen, learn, evolve is a really key part of it. And I've seen that in some startup communities or some places elsewhere in the country where, the natural thing that happens when you go from a place where there wasn't vibrancy and success, now there's vibrancy and success, there's a lot of entrepreneurial activity, there's a lot of energy, the local economy is doing better, then people show up and start trying to control it, right? And so this notion, this natural tendency to try to put structure and control around things when they're working, oftentimes with good intentions, but a lot of times because, oh, that's mine, I want to have that. Right, and that's especially true when I think Boulder's a good counterexample, right? There were, I like to say, when I wrote Startup Communities in 2012, I referred back to people when I moved here in '95. There were, a dozen people I knew that were still very active in the startup community in 2012. Most of them are still very active today. I don't think any of them are trying, including me, are trying to control what's going on, right? So sort of that notion of allowing it not to be this sort of almost by definition inwardly facing thing. By the way, I think that works in knowing what little I know about Sam's world, mostly from reading his book, and no, you're not too subtle, and it's a wonderful thing, is it works because if you look at, and I know a few of the organizations and a few of the people that are in Sam's orbit, he's not trying to control them, right? He's trying to help amplify them. And he's allocating capital to them, but he's not saying, and you must then do this. I'm sure you have opinions and suggestions the same way I have opinions and suggestions, but that control factor, I think, works against it as well.
Sure, up front.
Thanks. So as we think about the system dynamics of Give First, I'm trying to think a little bit about the supply side of generosity. I know in the nonprofit sector, donor fatigue is an issue. How does that sort of parallel with the Give First model? Do we see sort of engagement fatigue? And if it's different, what are the sort of underpinnings that sort of inform that difference?
Is it give first but don't get exhausted?
Well, there's an element of that, but I think donor fatigue is a good thing to lay it against, because I think it's very different. So the solution for an individual against the backdrop of give first is to allocate the appropriate amount of your energy to proactively doing things on that vector, and the rest of your time having that be your philosophical approach. So you could spend 0% of your time doing things proactively, but in a reactive environment in your day-to-day work, having that as your philosophy, and my guess is you're not going to run out of time, or you're not going to run out of energy, right? Because it just becomes embedded into how you approach things. Every time you interact with somebody, you're thinking about how can I be helpful in this context? And a lot of times you're not necessarily going to have something tangible. As you move that slider to a larger percentage of your time, and it becomes more deliberate, then you start to run into the place where it becomes tiresome, or there's an imbalance of what's ultimately coming back. Again, you have to play a long-term game. Like if your measurement of time is a week, you're going to be sorely disappointed, right? I did something for you last week. Where's my stuff? But if you have the right time frame and then you modulate it against the right energy, against the backdrop of what you're doing, I think you'll be fine. As you move that slider too far down to the 100% mark, you end up like the person I was describing that was 80% of.
Right, I was going to go back to that person.
Yeah,
I mean,
so,
I think the donor exhaustion thing, that's a very different kind of interchange. Because if you have a donor who's being asked repeatedly, give, and they're not feeling, they got their plaque, but other than their plaque, they're not feeling that reciprocation from the system. Back to your slide, Brad, where ultimately this is not about just give. It's the system should be returning something. And your person who put 80% of this into the system and then their business failed, they're going to be exhausted and bitter and angry, as you said, for a variety of reasons.
So your point, I'm going to ask Sam a question, because he's been an active philanthropist longer than Amy and I have, so I have something to learn from him here. But I think the power of what you just said is it's the inverse of the thing, right? In Give First, it's under your control to decide where the energy's going. Donor fatigue is a function of people coming at you constantly.
And asking.
And by the way, as an investor, not just do I have investor fatigue or entrepreneur fatigue, right? Every day I get another 20 things that I have to say no to. I have extraordinary decision fatigue, right? At the end of the day, I said no 50 times. I so badly want to say yes to something, right? And so when I go out to dinner, I'm screwed, right? I'm like, fried calamari? Yes! Things that are not good for me but that are tasty, yes, please give me some of that. Like I have no more no's in me because I used them up all day long. And so, the question I have for you, especially in a philanthropic context, I know how I deal with it, but being a visible philanthropist, how do you calibrate against all the inbound?
Tell him to call my wife.
That's
See,
that doesn't work because my wife just says, fuck you, don't Why did you tell him to call me?
I figured out, I'm on everybody's list, as I'm sure you are, and I'm pitched all the time for philanthropic objectives, and you need somebody who is philanthropically disciplined for it to work, and I am not. And
so you have poor impulse control like me.
Yeah, I just give it to my wife, and she enjoys saying no.
And she's good at it. All right, I think we have time for maybe one more. How about there?
Hi, I'm Courtney. I'm a third-year law student. This concept is exciting. We learned about it from Brad Bernthal in our venture capital class, so plug for that if you haven't taken it yet. I'm curious about, we seem to be talking sometimes in extremes about you're either in with the system or you've screwed up and you're out reputationally, or you're fired. And sometimes it's because you want to screw other people or something else.
Whatever. Yeah.
So I'm curious about the in-between. You touched on it a little bit, Brad, when you said, when I feel taken advantage of, I need to assert a boundary and have a conversation. What about the define the relationship point, the DTR conversation of I need to define the transaction, I need to define the exchange, and the Give First model has worked for a while, but now it's time to make it concrete. Can you explain either some triggers or rules, or maybe even just an example of that in between where you don't need to get rid of them, but the give first model isn't quite working at this point in the transaction?
I can give a great example from a company that we wanted to invest in and actually thought we were, our perception is that we gave first a lot and were extremely helpful to the company. And then in the end, the company's behavior was one where ultimately, even though it may be a successful company, we decided we didn't want to be an investor even after we weren't. And here's what happened. It was a young company that we ended up liking what they did. We didn't invest, somebody else invested that round, but we were very helpful to them in terms of their business, gave them lots of feedback, became a customer. Then as they started to have growth and momentum, we actually very heavily promoted them, more so than their other investors, to other potential customers, and continued to engage a lot in terms of proactive feedback as well as reactive whenever they reached out to us. They were not raising a financing because they weren't in a place where they had decided to go raise the next financing. But we said, look, we want to invest in you. We're really excited about what you're doing, and we'd like to invest in you. And we're willing to put this money in you now, even though you're not in a place where you need it. We're willing to effectively overpay for where you are today to be supportive of where the fact that you don't need the money today. And a lot of happy talk around it, including, well, we don't really want to raise money, and maybe we could do it this way. And we eventually made an offer that was more money than they thought they were asking for. And frankly, probably on better terms than they were kind of asking for on the other money. And back and forth. And then a couple weeks later, there was some a slowdown in the interaction that was odd to us. And then, not surprisingly, the next thing that happened was they told us that they had an offer at a higher price. And if we wanted to meet the offer at the higher price, they really wanted our money because of all the wonderful things we'd done for them and the way we behaved. But if we just met the price at the higher offer, they would take our money. And by that point, we said, you know what, no. And it wasn't even the price. The price was a stretch either way. But that didn't feel right to us in the context of all the things we'd done up front. And, let's go back to the conversation about greed. Greed would have said, invest at that price. And for us, we have lots of other opportunities to invest and lots of other things that could work. And we just decided we didn't want to be in business because of that dynamic. Now, we've continued to be a customer of that business, and we've tried to be helpful, and we're an indirect investor through other funds that we're investors in, so we have some economic stake in their outcome. But it's where you then decide to spend your time. And, I don't know how, we were proactive about defining the relationship. And if we look across all the companies we invest in, there's an entrepreneur that I'm talking to right now that we're evaluating investing in. And, 6-9 months ago, we looked at the company and decided not to invest at that time, but we're helpful through that period of time. And she's now raising money, and I don't know whether we'll decide to invest or not, but we'll be helpful anyway. And part of it is the way that she's engaged with us around this whole cycle, right? She's been appreciative. She's been helpful to us. That is reciprocated from us being helpful to her. So those cultural dynamics, the cultural norms of the interaction feel like they fit with us. But with this other founder, in what is becoming a successful company, the cultural norms didn't feel like they fit. So that would be an example of how I think about it. I think you can scale it up or scale it down.
All right, Sam, I think I'm going to give you the last word, and here's the last question. What advice would you give to newish entrepreneurs?
Look how young Bob looks.
Yeah, newish entrepreneurs or just entrepreneurs in general in the audience. Because we've already got Give First on the table, right? Anything else you would add?
The 11th commandment. And the 11th commandment is, thou shalt not take oneself seriously. Nothing more to say.
All right. On that note, thank you to the two of you.
Roger. Thanks. I'll see you later.
I think you have a break now for 15 minutes, right? Back at 2:30. Thank you.
All right, welcome back, everyone. For those that enjoyed the break, I think Silicon Flatirons recognizes among Anna Noskazy's many powerful contributions. One of the most important was to observe, people need to get out of seats and actually have breaks, and so you can give Anna a hug as a thank you for any breaks that you see in our schedule. Our next panel is going to focus on Give First as it relates to group activity, and we're going to start with a discussion led by, well, I should say, a 10-minute presentation by Phil Fernbach. Phil is a professor here at CU. He's in the Leeds School of Business, and he is the author of a book called The Knowledge Illusion. By way of background, Jason actually introduced Phil and I and was like, oh my God, this research is super interesting. And I went and found a TED Talk that Phil had done, and I think you're going to enjoy the ideas as much as I did. And then from there, we'll ask the panelists to come down and we'll roll into the first panel discussion. Thanks for being here, Phil. Yeah.
Hi, everybody. Really happy to be here. I'm a cognitive scientist by training, so I study the way that the mind works, how we make decisions, how we think. I'm especially interested and fascinated by asking the question, where do our attitudes come from and our beliefs about the world, and how do we store knowledge, and those kinds of big questions. And this is my book, The Knowledge Illusion, which explores some of those big ideas through the lens of cognitive science. And I want to give you guys a little bit of a taste of some of the big ideas that we talk about in that book as a prelude to the discussion that we're going to have about Give First. The starting point of the ideas in this book comes from some puzzling data in psychology. And we're going to start in kind of a funny place with toilets, of all things. This is research that was originally done by a psychologist named Frank Kyle at Yale. And what Kyle was very interested in was, what do we sort of know about everyday household objects? Okay, like this toilet is my favorite example. What's really great about this research is that we can sort of do the experiment while we sit here. Okay? So the first thing I'm going to ask you to do in this experiment is I'm going to ask you to think about how well you understand how something works, like this toilet. And I don't want you to think too hard about it. I just want you to give that first sort of initial impression of your understanding. If you're like most people, you're sort of nodding and you're saying, yeah, I kind of know how a toilet works. I have a decent sense of that. You think that somewhere inside your head is something that's sort of like this annotated plumbing diagram. Okay, but here's the trick. In the next phase of the experiment, what I'm going to do is I'm going to ask you to explain it to me in detail. Explain to me exactly how it works. And then something really interesting happens. This is what happens. People reach inside and they realize that they have almost nothing to say. It turns out that we know remarkably little about the way that the world works. And yet, that initial impression, that initial feeling we have is, I understand this in some depth. I have some idea about how things work. That's what we call the knowledge illusion. It's an extremely robust phenomenon. Maybe you're a plumber, or you just fixed your toilet, and this example doesn't resonate with you. Let me give you another one. We're in Boulder, so I'm sure all of you guys love to tool around on your bikes like I do. There's this great paper by a psychologist named Rebecca Lawson, who incidentally had the best title I've ever seen for a psychology paper, Psychology. And she gave people a really easy task. Okay? This is a schematic of a bicycle. It's correct, shows how the parts fit together and so on. What Lawson did was she gave people drawings of a bike like this, but they were missing a few of the pieces. They were missing the frame and the chain and a couple other parts. And she simply asked people to draw on those parts. Should be pretty easy, right? We roll around on our bikes all the time. We should know something about how they work. It actually turns out that it's not easy at all. This is an extremely hard task. These are the attempts of some of her subjects. And these are not cherry-picked examples, okay? This is sort of the average performance on this task. It's really, really hard. If you guys want to have some fun after this, go and try to complete this task, see how well you do. It's really, really hard. I find this pretty remarkable. This is an object that we interact with all the time, and yet we retain almost nothing about the way that it functions. It turns out that a couple months ago, there was an Italian artist who actually independently discovered this effect. I don't think he knew about Lawson's work, but he and his friends loved to ride around on their bikes, and at some point he realized that none of his friends could draw a bike. So he decided to turn it into an art installation. And the first thing he did was he had his friends draw the bikes, and you end up getting stuff that looks very similar to what Lawson found. But then he took it a step further, and he actually built the bikes. This is like an MC Escher bike. It would never work. What I love about this is that, to me, an effective art installation is something that captures something really deep and important about the human condition. And the reason we wrote a whole book about this phenomenon is that at some point we had the realization that this isn't about bicycles and toilets, but that this is a really, really deep truth about the nature of the mind and the way we store information. And it applies to the most important things that we grapple with as individuals and as society. Just to give you a little taste of that, we've done a lot of work applying these ideas in the domain of policy and public discourse. And a few years ago, we ran a series of studies trying to understand whether this knowledge illusion contributes to polarization and extremity around the kinds of things that we argue about as a society, the things that we all have really passionate views about. We took some of the most important issues of the day, things like whether we should have a national flat tax, whether we should have a cap and trade system on carbon emissions, whether we should impose unilateral sanctions on Iran for its nuclear program. We brought people into the lab, and we essentially did the equivalent of the toilet experiment on them. And what we found over and over again was that the knowledge illusion contributed to the strength of people's attitudes. So people come into the lab, and they're pretty happy to voice pretty strong opinions about these issues. We ask them to try to explain them in detail, and two things happen. One thing that happens is that people become a little more humble. They fail in their explanations, and they go, wow, I don't understand this issue as well as I thought I did. It's a real eye-opener to them, maybe the same way that you felt when you tried to explain the toilet. The other effect is that they back off those strong positions a little bit. They become a little more moderate, which makes perfect sense. If you realize that you're not on firm ground in terms of your understanding of an issue, maybe you shouldn't have such a strong opinion about it. This, I think, is a really interesting result because it's amazing the extent to which human beings have really strong attitudes about really complicated issues that we end up not knowing very much about or not having a lot of depth of knowledge about. Policy is a great example. Most of us know next to nothing about any of these things. You ask people to explain, you get maybe a sentence or two at the most. Now, one sort of natural reaction, I think, when you see these kind of results is to feel kind of exasperated about human beings, embarrassed for humans. You say, how can we be so ignorant? How can we be so stupid? Like, clearly the answer is that we all need to become much more educated on every topic before we take positions and so on. I actually think that that's not at all the right way to think about this. And to illustrate why, I want to just give you a sense of one of the big ideas in the book, which is that the human mind is not built to store a lot of detailed information. There was a really great set of studies done by a guy named Tom Landauer in the 80s. He was at Colorado for a while, and then this work was done when he was at Bell Labs. In the 80s, cognitive scientists took very seriously the idea that the mind is very similar to a computer, like a desktop computer. And so what Landauer said was, well, can we measure the size of an individual's knowledge base, how much you know, like your explicit knowledge, and can we do that in the same scale that we use to measure computer memory, so in bytes? And he did this in a variety of different ways to get to his estimate, and got to more or less the same estimate every way he did it. I'll tell you just in 30 seconds one of the approaches, because I think it's really ingenious. He looked at results of memory experiments. So in these experiments, I'll have you come into the lab, you'll study some information, some text or some music or some pictures, and then I'll test you on that material after you've studied it, and then I'll bring you back into the lab and test you after a delay. Using that data, what I can do is I can figure out how fast you acquire knowledge and how fast you forget it. I can sort of estimate the rate at which you acquire knowledge. And then he just made a simplifying assumption that we go through life acquiring knowledge at that rate all the time, and we do that for 70 years. Okay? And that got him to his estimate. And that's what I'm going to show you now. And when I saw this number, it sort of blew my mind. I was just amazed by it because it's 1 gigabyte. which, the thumb drive sitting over here on the table is 64 gigabytes. It's like kind of a shocking result. Really changed my perspective a lot on the nature of the mind and of the way we think. Now, this might seem like a scary number, kind of like, oh my gosh, I only have 1 gigabyte. But if you step back and you think about it, it actually makes a lot of sense. So the world is just hopelessly, hopelessly complex. Even simple things are incredibly complex. They have hidden layers of complexity. And as individuals, if we tried to master the world and all of its complexity, it would just be an exercise in futility. There's just no way that one individual can really master any part of the world. And it turns out that what really makes us special as human beings is not our ability to think as individuals, to store a lot of information, or to be able to process a lot of information really quickly as individuals. And that brings us to the second big idea of the book, which I think really should resonate with the crowd here, because it's really about community. And the idea is that human beings are not designed as individual thinkers. What really makes us special and unique is not our ability for individual cognition. It's actually the ability to collaborate with others, to engage in a kind of collaborative cognition whereby, as individuals, we can all be really ignorant. We might have our little slice of expertise, and yet our minds are really designed for this kind of collaborative effort, which allows us to combine and pursue goals of arbitrary complexity. I'm going to just give you one illustration of this, which I think is really evocative. This is a video from work by a comparative psychologist named Michael Tomasello. Tomasello studies comparative psychology. So he looks at human children's capabilities, cognitive capacities, and compares them to other kinds of animals like chimpanzees. Yeah. So I love this video. I love it for one, just because it's really cute. But I also love it because I think a lot of you look at that and you say, wow, that's cool, but that's pretty easy, right? Like, that's natural. That's little kid, of course he did that, right? But it actually turns out that kid's like 1.5 years old. And what that kid just did is something really incredible from a cognitive perspective. The kind of cognitive machinery we need to engage in shared goal pursuit like that is really incredible. That young child has to represent that the experimenter has a mind and has mental states, like a desire to open the cabinet, does not have the current wherewithal to do it, has to figure out how to coordinate his own behavior to achieve the goal, and so on. This is something that no other animals can do like human beings. It's really what sets us apart. It's what makes us special. And that's, sort of at the most basic level, the capacity that's really important. But if you think about what that allows, facilitates when you scale it up, it's really amazing. So this is one of humanity's great works, the Milan Cathedral. Construction on this began in 1386, and the facade was completed under Napoleon in the 1800s. Okay, and it turns out that when you build a cathedral, you have a punch list, like when you're doing a home renovation. The punch list was completed in 1960. So it took 600 years to build this thing. And in that time, there were 75 chief engineers in charge of the project, and just thousands and thousands of people involved. And if you think about what any one of those individuals knew, it was not 1/1000th of the knowledge that was required to do this. So it's really this ability to engage in this collaborative thinking where individuals can be relatively ignorant, but the group knows a lot, and we have these underlying cognitive capacities that are really aimed at achieving these kinds of things. That allows us to do just about everything that human beings do, which is really amazing. One way of thinking about this is, I like to think about this analogy to a beehive. We're very used to thinking about thinking and from the perspective of an individual, right? What does an individual know? How smart is that person? How much information do they process, and so on? A very different way of thinking about it is kind of like bees. In a beehive, you actually have a lot of complexity. So if you look inside the hive, there's different areas of the hive that are dedicated to different functions. There's protectors of the hive. There's mechanisms for introducing genetic diversity. There's mechanisms for collecting food, and so on. It's a really complicated set of behaviors. There's no one in charge, right? Every individual is doing their own little specialized job, and the complexity emerges. That's kind of how you can think about a community of knowledge. We each have our own little slice of expertise, and you put it all together and you get something that's really can be incredibly complex and amazing. Now, I'm about to wrap up here, but I want to end by saying that is the amazing thing about human beings. This communal thinking, this ability to collaborate, is what really makes us special. It's what allows us to do really amazing things. But there is this sort of hidden dark side of this, and what that is that if you step back and think about the implications of these ideas for what you believe and what you think about the world, there's a really profound implication. And that implication is that most of what you believe you can't actually justify based on knowledge that exists inside your own head. Most of what we think we know is really pointers to other people or information that's out there in our communities of knowledge. Now, this is true for complicated things like healthcare policy, right? Like how much do we really know when we voice that really strong opinion? But it's also true about kind of mundane things, right? Like really basic beliefs, like we all believe that the Earth revolves around the sun. Of course we do, but we think about how you would actually justify that belief. What are the observations that you can point to that actually would justify that belief? I know that I can't really do that. I mean, in the end, what we're really doing is we're relying on somebody else. We believe that because in the end, someone kind of told us it was true. The dark side is that we often fail to appreciate what's inside our head and what's outside of our head. By virtue of participating in the community of knowledge, we often feel that we have the knowledge ourselves by virtue of it being out in the community. And that's what we argue in the book is really the root of this knowledge illusion. It's so natural for us to draw knowledge from outside of our heads that we often fail to recognize those boundaries. So I'll stop there, and hopefully this will be good fodder for having an interesting discussion. Thanks so much.
While we're getting set up here, I think Brad mentioned earlier that we take a lot of ranked
Sit
meetings
here.
and different mentality. And I've started every time I have a ranked meeting, I ask the person to draw a picture of a bicycle. I met Phil about 6 months ago, and every time I rank meeting, I take this usually over a beer and a coffee, and I take a little piece of paper and I say, draw a bicycle. This has been going on for, was it 6 months ago I met? 9 months ago?
Something like that.
Yeah, nobody's gotten it right. Not a single person has been able to, and I keep them at my house, so I have to stack.
Oh, really?
Yeah, and I put the names on because I figure one day I'll blackmail.
Oh, I love it. I love it.
I'm a firm believer in your thesis. I think it's really interesting work. Let me try your mic. The light is on. It says on. I am used to being on stage. Can anybody hear me if I'm okay? All right, cool. So let me start with you, Phil. So in this world of a knowledge illusion where we have groupthink, which could be good, could be bad. I mean, in some ways it's good, otherwise we wouldn't have computers and rocket ships, and in some ways it's bad that we've got polarized electoral, that everybody thinks they know what they're doing when nobody knows what they're doing. And I know part of your research is showing that the people who actually know the least amount actually have the most polarizing opinions.
That's right.
Which you
In
didn't
some
talk
cases,
about
that's
today,
true.
but I know that's part of your research in your book. By the way, it's a fabulous book. You have to read it. How does a give first society work? And if we look, I'm going to posit there's 3 types of societies. There's ones that don't interact with each other. There's ones that interact with each other but are completely transactional based. We'll call that Washington, D.C., or potentially the Silicon Valley. And then we have give first societies, which I'm very proud of that we have here in Boulder. The give first, is that exacerbating your problem or making it better?
Well, that's a great question. So the way I think about it is I think a very normal mode underlying belief that people have, especially in the marketplace, is sort of a zero-sum mentality.
Yeah.
Right, and so I think that's why a give-first kind of mentality is very revolutionary. And it has that underlying belief that we can actually multiply productivity. Everybody can be better off in a community where people are giving to each other. We definitely talk in the book about how the best way to create sort of super intelligence is to utilize a network where you do have that kind of norm. So I think it's a great thing. Of course, there are potentially these kind of hidden downsides, right? Like you can get kind of groupthink sort of.
Yeah, I will say that, knowing a lot more about Give First than before I met you, I thought we were doing a good job by bringing people in and training everybody, giving away all the knowledge we could, and then I read your book, and I'm like, I've done a horrible disservice. And you spend all your time looking at networks, and not all your time, maybe you have some hobbies, but from what I know of you.
I draw bikes.
You draw bikes. In fact, your husband's a cyclist, and who's here?
I'm
Are you
gonna
going to go
test,
home?
of course.
Yeah, you're going to go home and be like, honey, draw a bike. Right. I would like to know the results of that.
I'll tell you tomorrow.
Thank you. What do you feel about this? You study, for those of you who haven't read her seminal work, the idea was that the networked ecosystem of Silicon Valley was what won over the East Coast, very vertically focused, sort of keep knowledge tight, whether it was through non-competes or NDAs or other things, and the Silicon Valley had a networked approach, which you said this is why, one of the big reasons why the Silicon Valley has done great.
Right.
Do you view Silicon Valley as a give first ecosystem? And let me leave it there. Let's start there. Do you view Silicon Valley as a give first ecosystem?
I mean, I'd never heard of Give First until I was invited to this, but I certainly think that both the idea of Give First and this knowledge illusion have a lot of applicability in a place like Silicon Valley. Silicon Valley was not built by, if you took the individuals of Silicon Valley and distributed them around the world, they would not accomplish what they have achieved by being in proximity and working together. I think, so what the Give First, it was a fascinating conversation this morning, or earlier today, about trust, about, it's actually studied trust, it's qualified trust, it's not blind trust. And so it's not just that people give first, but also people do compete. So that competition is an important piece of this story, I think, because you can compete and still be sharing openly the information you have, trying to strengthen the community. And I think that at its best, Silicon Valley was a healthy mix of people collaborating in all sorts of ways, often not knowing it, and also competing with one another. I guess I would also say that the story that I told about Boston, and I told a story about Boston and Silicon Valley in the 80s and 90s, and in the mini computer, shift from the mini computer to the personal computer. And in that year, I argued that Boston fell behind because its activity was contained within these small number of autarkic corporations. So there actually were knowledge networks. They were just contained within the firm. So that's a good sort of counterpart to this. People can get into these cliques where their knowledge is inward looking and they never test it. So that's, whereas in Silicon Valley, the knowledge was distributed across many different companies, and people were tested all the time at the same time that they were sharing. So I think you want to think about the balance between, your commitment to your small group and your commitment to the broader community.
So I'll pick on Nicole here. So Nicole, you and I, for those of you who don't know, Nicole's with Techstars, who's got, accelerators now from Boulder to Berlin.
And farther.
And farther. But
Much
the
farther.
alliteration didn't work. I didn't Boulder to Berlin because there's an E. So all over the world, let's say that.
Bangalore?
Yeah, Bangalore, that's right. You've got one in Bangalore, you win. You've got obviously visibility in a lot of these different markets. You and I have spoken a lot in the past about how Boulder competes against other markets, and I know that you and I believe that Give First mentality is one of our biggest strengths. How do you look at other markets? Do you think that all of the burgeoning startup markets are Give First mentality? Is that a prerequisite to compete against the incumbents? Are there other things that are more important? How do you look at this as an important factor?
Yeah, so it's funny because we've got into a couple markets where they weren't Give First at all. In fact, many of them were Take First. And not to pick on New York, I was in New York for a while, and New York being a very transactional city, where their currency there is knowledge. And so to not share knowledge, to have knowledge that you have that somebody else doesn't have was a power positioning thing. And so going into New York, I was really worried that our model of Give First and this model of really having mentors, give first to participate in the mentorship of our companies, we weren't sure it was going to work. And what was really funny is that they loved it. I mean, people, when you begin to see that it isn't a scarcity model, when you begin to see that it is an abundance model, that when you participate, you make the whole stronger, which then makes you stronger, which presents you with more opportunities. When you begin to witness that, you start to see the power of it. You start to feel like you belong to something that's bigger than you, and people wholeheartedly jump in. Now, yeah, there's a lot of skepticism around it, and it takes a little while to win people over, but we haven't yet experienced a location and a geo where it hasn't worked. Yeah, they love it, and they want to get involved, and right now we have more requests for mentors than we can handle. People want to be they want to be part of this, and one of the things that we've struggled with as a company, struggle's not the word, I wouldn't say that, I would say one of the things that we've contemplated is where does the line of Techstars mentorship end and community begin, and how do those things interact in such a way that everybody can participate in a mentorship give first ecosystem, even if it isn't just with Techstars. And so we're always thinking about how we can help the community as a whole, not just our programs. And it's been really fascinating to watch that even in areas where you would be very skeptical of it, it's worked magical.
Maybe, I think my mic is coming in and out, so sorry, I'm trying to reset it here, but maybe Phil, this is your next.
I wanted to ask a question, actually.
Yeah, I mean, I was thinking maybe this is your next story. Right.
I wanted to ask, so Brad started the discussion by saying this is not altruistic. People are in it for something. I mean, how true is that?
100%.
So,
Yeah.
if you're a mentor,
100%.
really,
I don't believe in 100% altruism. I don't.
No, but I mean,
No, it's
it's
0%
not
altruistic.
altruistic.
Yeah.
It's not zero, but it's 100% more self-interest than it is altruism.
Yeah, I mean, I don't know, when I think, I'm going to make some broad assumptions that I know nothing about, so my knowledge illusion is that I know something here, and I probably don't, but just an observation of the community. I think that people in today's ecosystem want to feel part of something. They feel alone. They feel like they're in this by themselves. And when they start to feel part of something bigger than them, that encourages and excites them. Like it used to be you belonged to a church, right? Or the communities were much, much smaller. You had your whole family around you and you knew your place there. But we don't have, that's not our society anymore. And so when you give people a sense of belonging, are they getting something out of that? You bet. Right? But that's okay. It's when you can align those interests that magic can happen.
but it's not necessarily an economic interest, right?
Oh,
Can be.
It can be.
It can be.
That doesn't necessarily have to be a bad thing, though.
Isn't it also about identity? I mean, when you're in a community, it becomes who you are. And so you're creating a set of identity. I mean, I think it was very powerful in Silicon Valley that different groups created a shared identity, partly through this mentoring process, partly through collaborating and whatnot. And so if you can take on an identity that you're part of a community that is giving first, rather than,
Taking,
yeah, this is the negative spiral, the lock-in spiral.
And Stephanie, you're among the many jobs you hold. You're, one of the spearheads of entrepreneurship, growing all over more than just the Front Range in our entire state. What do you see from a Colorado perspective as far as, are you seeing what Nicole's seen internationally? Are you seeing that this is important? Is it interesting? Is there skepticism? Is this more open state?
It's funny. I don't know if you can hear me, but it's first of all, I was really thrilled to hear that I'm not supposed to be smart, that other people are, because God, it's a relief that I actually stealing other people's ideas are actually part of the system. That's fantastic, because that's my lead shtick. So a couple things I'd say that are really interesting, that I've found profoundly interesting in places that are not as dense. So a dense population in the Bay Area, in New York, and even to a certain extent here in Boulder and in Denver, you do have this kind of paradigm where people are either they're hoarding knowledge or really believe that they can contribute and therefore create validation for themselves that are important, which is, again, the self-interest in mind. What I found maybe across the Intermountain West is that there's also this pioneering spirit that leads to people not accepting. So it's not just about giving. You also have to be able to accept and integrate and nurture. We are in small towns across Colorado constantly trying to help build entrepreneurial ecosystems. And I can't tell you how many times we're talking to people and they're like, what's in it for you? I don't want to, I have pride in my ability to do this on my own. And it is that breaking down those barriers just by continuing to show up and continuing to focus on the ecosystem has been really, really eye-opening for me. We were in Durango, it was a steamboat, and sitting with a group of people, pretty sophisticated, savvy people, and the guy's like, here's what we're going to do. We're going to help you convene, and we're not going to tell you where to convene. We're just going to give you money so you can start organizing your community. And I swear to God, we had to spend a half an hour on why we weren't charging for this, why we weren't, why we weren't actually, what were we getting out of it?
Helpful.
Because we just wanted, that's where we spend most of the time, is you have to be, giving first is fantastic, but you also have to accept. And I think that's I think that happened almost in the Valley, kind of behind, that happened almost unintentionally. People just absorbed things because of what they were hearing and feeling, and not because out of pride they thought they learned something, if that makes sense.
I would argue, and Phil and Anna, you can tell me I'm wrong because I'm a very, very, very part-time professor, but I've always learned more teaching than anything else. And do you agree with that?
If you really want to learn your stuff, try to teach it.
Right. And I think I never realized my knowledge illusion as much as when I started Techstars mentoring and realizing, wait, I'm supposed to talk on this subject matter for 90 minutes, and I can get about 7. So I actually better go study and figure out what the hell. And what I would say, when you asked, isn't this altruistic? I say, no, it's very selfish, in that being part of a Give First knowledge ecosystem means you're actually having to push yourself to learn, and I think inherently get past this knowledge illusion, which some of us or all of us know we have, but not so eloquently as you said.
Well, it's interesting, because if I think about what do I enjoy doing with students or whatever, I mean, I love teaching, but it is very easy for me to mentor them about their careers. Something that I've lived through, it's very easy for me to talk to them. I can give lots of advice. I've been through, rehearsing what I taught in that seminar 10 years ago, I would have to brush up. So things that you live through and have experienced, you actually internalize. But there's a lot of knowledge that just, only 1 gigabyte, it just doesn't stick.
That's right.
So I'm going to change topics a little bit here. You mentioned earlier that this networked effect was what created Silicon Valley's advantage over Boston. And that was back where we had these big companies, and then there were all these startups, which then took out all the incumbents, and everybody looked around and said, oh my goodness, what happened?
Okay.
I would argue, having lived a decade in the Bay Area and here the last 12 years, that we're sort of seeing a back to the future, back to the past sort of situation in Silicon Valley, where you've got these behemoth companies, and it's the Apples of the world, and we can name the Facebooks and the Googles of the world, which are duplicating what we saw in some respects back in Boston. And then I will throw another. I personally, as about 40% of our investments at Foundry are in the Bay Area. I don't feel that is a give first ecosystem anymore. I will say that I think that it's become a very take first to a lot of people. There are people who are giving to the community, but in general, it's a very take first. And I'd like you to comment on what you think the future is going to look like in the Silicon Valley, given the research you've done.
Well, so, the first thing I have to say is that I did this research, and then in about 2004, I stopped and became a dean, and I've been growing a school, and so I haven't been doing research. And so when people say to me things like, wow, look at Apple, it's so big, it's so inward looking, or Google and Facebook, obviously they, it used to be easy to say, oh, Microsoft can get taken out, don't assume that it will last forever. But there are certain structural features now of the kind of competition that we see with Google and Facebook that suggest that they can not only continue to succeed, but also take out small competitors by acquiring them or whatever. So Amazon is another good example. So because my crystal ball has been so bad in the past, I'm not going to...
That doesn't mean you shouldn't keep trying.
I wrote a master's thesis in 1978 that predicted that Silicon Valley would stop growing. So that was in 78.
Your timing was off.
Yeah. So now it's... I think, the question I have in my mind is, is there still a healthy ecosystem outside of the big companies, or are they so powerful that they are literally like the big tree that shades out the undergrowth?
Can I say something about this? So the evidence would say that since the Great Recession, from 2002 to now, and in fact, I don't know if that's mine, but the pace of business formation is off by 2/3. And so you have
by 2/3.
Off
in the U.S. as
in
a
the U.S.
whole. Yeah, but
in the U.S. as a whole, it's off by 2/3, and and the concentration of both workforce and and GDP is concentrated in fewer companies.
I know that.
Which would give you would say we know that, or we can know that. I swear to God, I read about that. I can point to evidence. I read it, and you can know that. So do you? There's got to be some correlation there.
Yeah, but the problem is if you generalize national trends to Silicon Valley, you get it wrong every time. So I know all that data.
It's not declining. It's actually happening in fewer places. It's just across the country it's happening, meaning that in Silicon Valley, in New York, and in Texas and other, probably 4 or 5 areas, it's growing. It's actually growing or flat. It's not anywhere else.
So I heard Jason is actually suggesting that it was going to stop growing in Silicon Valley.
I'm just suggesting that the mentality of network effect is, I believe, given these behemoth companies and that I don't view the ecosystem, the participants, the players being give first, is that going to have an effect?
So again, you would have to get in and do some real research to make that statement with any confidence. I am sure there are people that are give first. I'm also sure there are complete jerks who always take and hoard and everything like that. So making a generalization, it's going to be hard for me. I do think that the data suggests that Silicon Valley continues to take about 40% of venture capital in the US, continues to have a rate of startups that is just as high, continues to innovate. I mean, where's AI happening the most? So I think, empirically from the outside, you could predict decline because of the big guys, and you could predict continued dynamism, So I'm not willing to quite go down that pathway. I certainly think that it has changed a lot since I did my research. And I think, the turning point, I think, was the dot-com boom. So much money came in, so many millions, and then, so essentially once...
I've blocked that out. Completely just blocked it out.
Well, but once you got the rest of the world discovering and investing in Silicon Valley, there was too much money. And we've had periods where there's so much money that you're just doing silly things with money. And so I think that,
There is now, it finally has, just in the last year, the net migration out of the valley is actually negative for the first time.
Yeah.
And so that may be the tip of the spear, that may be, but that's probably not happening because of the ecosystem.
It's because of the cost of living.
That's
It's
right.
so damn high.
But I think it's got to be more than that, right? I mean, look at New York. Is the net immigration New York?
No.
I mean, New York is right up there in cost.
And Silicon Valley has been expensive for a long time. I mean, if you look at the U.S.-born people, they're migrating out, but foreigners still,
No, the net migration is negative.
I know net, but if you look just at outsiders, that's growing. The reason immigrants are growing the population, but the rest of the population is leading it to be a net outflow. I've seen the data. I know what you're saying. Yeah.
I can't imagine that it's because of only cost.
It's not cost.
It's because of many factors, right? One of them, of course, being cost.
But I agree with you. I think what I've always said is the reason people come to Silicon Valley, in spite of its insane cost, is because they benefit from the knowledge base there. And there's an incredibly deep, I call it a skill base, but it's a skill knowledge, whatever. That there are people there that have been there for decades, who have spent decades working in different companies, learning things about sales, about marketing, about startups, about ventures, about the legal system, and that being part of that accelerates your ability to grow a company.
Well, let's talk about being a part of that, because I've always been curious, is the Give First ecosystems, are they inclusive or not?
Well,
so when we talk about inclusion, who's being included, and is it different by geographies? Is it different in Silicon Valley versus here
here's
versus
who's
elsewhere?
included. I think in Silicon Valley, so I went in my second project, I said, well, I know all these white guys are doing great, but what about the immigrants? And so what I learned is that, Indian immigrants, Chinese immigrants, they succeeded very well too by creating their own networks and then integrating. I think, if you look at gender and if you look at certain kinds of ethnic minorities, they are not. I think people who have technical skill, doesn't matter what the color of their skin is, whether they have long hair or short hair, a degree from MIT or not, if they can show that they have technical skill, they're part of that community. So these are technical, I always call them technical communities. And I think anybody who can prove that they have the chops will succeed and often will become a part of a Give First. If you don't have those technical skills, it's going to be a hard place to live. So people who come from, who didn't come out of CS, women often, underrepresented minorities, they have a really hard time. It is a very gendered environment.
I don't think we're good at that here either. I mean, look at we can look in the room and say we've got a lot of white faces in the room,
Yeah.
right? I do see women, but I see a lot of men too.
Yeah.
Boulder isn't actually awesome at this. That might have something to do with cost of living, probably has a lot to do with cost of living. But I think it also just has to do with who is in your, who's in your immediate circle of friends, who's in your immediate communities. And so I have a couple black friends, but I have multiple orders of magnitude more white friends than I do black friends. So I don't have like all those people that I'm pulling into my ecosystem because I'm not exposed to them enough. And one of the things that I think we could do better in Boulder and beyond, Denver and beyond, is be much better about our inclusion. We're just not good at it. We've got pretty clear lines between ethnicities here and even age here. I think we're better about gender, but those are areas that we're not good at. We could benefit from an outreach of us helping pull other people.
Well, and that might be part of the give first mentality, is that instead of reaction, it's proaction.
Yeah. So the challenge with the Silicon Valley, I don't know about the startup communities that you guys work with, but if it's defined around technology and advancing technology, which is what Silicon Valley is broadly defined, then what are your inputs? You're people who have been educated, who have higher education, who have been through a system that really weeds out women often, weeds out ethnic minorities. At Berkeley, we have a horrible time. We're very bad at getting diversity. It's terrible. It's embarrassing. No, I mean, it's in a state where California is like 30% Hispanic, and at Berkeley, the population is 7% of students. That's appalling. But it's sort of, these communities can be very exclusionary if they're based on something like expertise.
So maybe, when we talk about diversity, one thing I'm becoming more and more concerned about, or I guess aware of, maybe this is very self-serving, is ageism. You're not supposed to laugh at that.
I'm the oldest one on
no,
the panel.
but it's interesting when Brad and I raised the first Foundry Fund along with our partners back in 2007. The number one question we got from investors was, "Aren't you guys too young?" And then in 2016, when we raised a fund, the number one question we got were, "Aren't you guys too old?" Now, and we're all laughing, but that was actually the number one question we got. So in 9 years, so apparently there's a 9-year gap that we're mentally capable of doing this job. Or it means that the perceptions and society are changing, that we were probably right aged when we started, and now a bunch of late 40, early 50-year-olds are too old. And a couple questions I wanted to talk about. I find a lot of diversity folks around. There's a whole bunch of different ways we can slice it, and they're all valid. But I don't think we talk enough about the age one. And I wanted to ask Phil, question to you. You said the part of the research that you were quoting was from 0 to 70, or learning at a certain rate, which I will just speak for myself. I'm not going to make it to 70 learning at that rate. I'm basically done. Did you notice any difference in your research based on age? Do people, as they get older, become worse and believe, more curmudgeonly believe what they believe and don't believe in the knowledge illusion, or do they actually become a little more humble, or is the data all over the place?
It definitely depends on the person. So this is not, at the average effect is that people get older, they get a little less overconfident. People moderate a little bit. I think it's because you learn more about the world, you learn about complexity. You have enough experiences where you go, man, I thought I understood that, and I did a little more research, and it was actually much more complicated than I thought it was. Now, that's, of course, not true of everybody. There are plenty of people who I think go through their whole lives not examining deeply the gaps in their knowledge, which is pretty amazing, actually, I think, the human being's ability to do that.
Do people become more rigid in their beliefs, though, as they get older? I mean, I do feel like as I get older, I become more and more aware of what I don't know.
Yeah.
But I also, I tend to look, it's confirmation bias, right? I tend to look for the facts that reinforce my existing beliefs. And so I would imagine as we get older, we become more rigid in our.
Yeah, that's a good point. I think another thing that happens is we get more and more embedded in a community. Right? When I moved to Boulder 7 years ago, I hardly knew anybody. Now I really feel like I'm part of the community in a deep way.
Nice to meet you.
your beliefs about the world and your attitudes and all that kind of stuff. Like I said before, it's not really necessarily a reflection of what you know or what you, the knowledge you have in your head. A lot of the times it's your reflection of your identity as a community member. And it's very hard to go against what your community believes on a certain issue for a lot of reasons, not just because you believe it to be the case, but also because it can affect your relationships and all that kind of stuff.
So that's actually really interesting. Is there a way that we as a community can be more open to people in our ecosystem that have differing beliefs that might allow us to better bridge this gap of inclusivity that we're not good at, right? That's probably one of the things that keeps people out is because of how we think about the world. So what can we do as a community to be more open-minded and be more embracing of those with differing opinions?
I mean, I like to talk about the concept of intellectual humility, which is something that chronically human beings aren't very good at. Now, I hesitate to say that too much because this is a room full of entrepreneurs, and I think that the special sauce of an entrepreneur is often a certain kind of overconfidence, which is adaptive when you're trying to start a company.
Functional.
Because you're gonna mess up like 9 times out of 10, but that's okay because the 10th time you're gonna do something really amazing. And so I do think that that there is an argument to be made for sort of adaptive overconfidence. That being said, I think there's also a really important argument to be made for open-mindedness. And I mean, this is innovator's dilemma and so on. Like you get so set into thinking in a certain way, you can miss what's new on the horizon.
How do you avoid intellectual lock-in? I mean, that's
exactly,
the question.
Exactly.
So one of the words that we use at Techstars that I use at the companies I work with is ontological arrogance, in that you believe that the world is the way that it is, and you know for a fact that it's that way, but that's only through the lens of your experience. And when you look through the lens of somebody else's experience, you might see the world in a very different way. And so we often talk about when we're being ontologically arrogant, although it can be very hard to know when you're being ontologically arrogant in the moment. And so learning how to come out of that. I mean, I'm Greek, so I'm particularly bad at this. We tend to react and then later realize we're idiots and then not admit it. But that like learning how to do it in the moment can be really tricky.
This is one of the hardest things. It's how do you know when you're inside of a house of mirrors? And it can be really, really difficult.
Should the filter be knowledge as an abstract versus knowledge in the moment? For instance, a lot of what we've talked about today is passing along knowledge in the abstract. Somebody says, how do I start a company? How do I raise money? It's an abstract question in some ways. I can give some ideas versus your house is on fire, to grab the kids and get out, or more particular to you, you're playing mandolin or guitar in the middle of a gig. And you have to know exactly what you're doing at that moment in time, otherwise the whole band falls apart. By the way, he's a bluegrass player, so I'm picking on him. How do you view? What'd you say?
Am I the only one that I got that?
No, thank you. I guess the couple things is should we be distinguishing when the knowledge illusion between abstract and in the moment, sort of you don't have a choice, and if so, is there something we can learn from things that we are experts on? Like you are an expert in that moment in that song with that band that we can expand to dissipate the knowledge illusion as you see it.
I mean, the way I think about it is, I'm not sure I'm going to answer the question you just asked, but let me say something a little bit different, which is that we can sort of train ourselves to be more reflective. It just doesn't come very naturally. I mean, our initial instinct is always, I got this, I understand it, right? The world is simple.
But if I hear it from my friends and I hear it from them, they keep saying it, it just gets reinforced in all sorts of ways.
It's not impossible to actually go through that process of verification and saying, you can't become an expert on the topic yourself typically, right? But what you can do is make sure that you're sort of trusting the right people, right? Verify the credibility and so on. And as human beings, that doesn't come naturally to us, so we don't do it very often.
So one concept first of all, I have to answer your question. Silicon Valley is ageist. There's no question. There's no question in my mind. We lost track of that. I think, there's a lot of people
Maybe you should move to Boulder.
Yeah, really. Are you guys don't have ageism here?
Oh, we're getting better at it. We're getting older.
Old people are not. Yeah, I mean,
Boulder is good at ageism?
No, we're bad. We're bad at
They
it.
want to hire people in their 20s. Oh, shit, I lost my other thought.
The Silicon Valley is ageist.
Yeah, but I was going to make a point. You were talking about, what did we say? You were
say the
answering his
concrete versus
question.
abstract.
Concrete versus abstract knowledge, yeah. So one of the concepts that hasn't come up, one of the reasons you can do give first or build a cathedral, is that people specialize. And so, so specialization is complementary, and so it's cumulative. I mean, the places where it becomes a zero-sum game is when everybody tries to do the same thing, and they compete head-on. So specialization does mean that you have knowledge, both applied and maybe or maybe not abstract knowledge, about a certain piece of a process. But just because I know how to, fix the derailleur on my bike, I may not know how the whole bike works. I probably do. But I mean, if I know how to build.
You want to draw a picture of a bike right now?
Oh.
Because I got this piece of paper here and I got this pen.
Which I would be so embarrassed. But so we often don't have. We have pieces of knowledge of things. He knows how to play the mandolin is
Guitar.
The guitar, but he doesn't know how to play the mandolin or the banjo. Yeah, I mean, and so that's what I think human accomplishment is built on. Specialization and collaboration.
And so if I can read between the lines of what you're saying, you're suggesting that if you have a specialized knowledge, in that context, it is actually much better to give first because you can share in that knowledge and help others around to get better.
And they will give back. I mean, I think, in academia, there's always this kind of, should I tell anybody about my research because they might, scoop me or something. But what you learn is that you learn much more if you let them know in on it. I mean, so I think, yeah, if you're confident in your specialization, it's much easier to give first.
Yeah, I remember in the early days of Techstars, it was 2009, and we were talking about going into Boston, and I had written the original playbook on how to run an accelerator with David Cohen, and he asked me to give it. Actually, it wasn't to the Boston people, but it was actually to Troy Hennicoff, a guy that was in Chicago, and at the time, Troy had nothing to do with Techstars, but David said, hey, you wrote that playbook to help the Boston program spin up. You should give it to this Troy guy. And I was like, who's Troy? And why would I give it to him? He's not a Techstars person. Like, this is our secret sauce. Why would we ever share this information? And I remember being really traumatized over that because I worked really hard on that and thinking it was just something that was really special to Techstars. And he said, like, I'm not exactly sure why we wouldn't. Like, let magic happen. And I think that was really at the counsel of you, Brad. And I remember being extremely skeptical of it. And then within probably 12 months, 6 to 12 months, realizing actually the ingenuity of it, in that all of a sudden we were being viewed as the experts in accelerators. Even though we hadn't run that many, we were still very new and still very learning how to do it, right? But all of a sudden we were being seen as the expert, and it was the tide that started to raise all of the ships, right? And as they were experimenting with doing stuff, they would come back to us and say, this is what we learned, and we would incorporate that into our playbook. And it became, it was a moment in time for me, a mental shift where I was like, oh.
That's a great example.
I got it.
That's a great example.
And I would have never gotten it had I not been almost forced into it. And then when you experience the magic of it, that other people, you make other people successful, and then they then turn around and make you more successful. And then it just is back and forth, reciprocal.
Yeah, so that reciprocity is really important, reciprocal innovation. I mean, I wrote about it in terms of like Silicon Valley in Taiwan, Silicon Valley in China, but it can happen, at any level, at any scale between individuals, regions,
So this has been a love fest of Give First. What are the negatives?
Oh, I can answer that.
I would say, so we don't, and again, this happens, I think I'm pretty involved right now in a ton of political campaigns, and I do not want to be. Just please, nobody email me anymore about politics. I'm not a politician, and I don't know anything about this, but I'm involved in it.
You know this guy named Phil Weiser?
Oh my God. I'm having another phone
He's running for AG. Okay.
Yeah. But the thing that's so interesting to me is that there are these. What tends to happen is, I think specifically around Give First, is that, and I don't think this is bad in and of itself, but I think it leads to something bad, is that you get just in an echo chamber. You're completely in an echo chamber because you're trying, there's vulnerability in giving, right? There's vulnerability in providing. You don't want to do this in an audience that's going to completely reject you, or in an ecosystem that won't accept you, and therefore you end up with the same type, and it creates a really exclusionary experience for many. And I think one thing that we can incorporate in Give First is, challenge always, continue to question and continue to debate and create discourse again at the ground level that has somewhat gone away because we are so divided right now. And I think that could be an element of the ecosystem that is core to it. That is one of our one of our principles is we are going to continually challenge our beliefs, and not in an area of debate, but in a kind of spirit of seeking to learn. I think that's something that we could definitely incorporate in, and I hope that I haven't missed that completely in the Give First, but I haven't seen it, so that isn't what I've seen in how these ecosystems are forming.
Well, I think that reciprocity.
Without question.
Because you do.
I mean, I take a lot of meetings from people that I don't know, and I really do work hard to help them. And I would say that 5% of them will cycle back with me in some manner and say, wow, that was really helpful, or hey, that wasn't helpful, but here was why. Or, I mean, I get the reciprocity. Man, I'll tell you that 5% is the thing that keeps me doing it for the other 95%. And the more the reciprocity, and I'm not looking for something in return, that's not it. It's knowing that my giving is having an impact in some way, that it was helpful, that it triggered a thought process, that it, whatever it was. And I just want to know that it's not being just thrown against a brick wall, because then, yeah, if that's happening, you're not getting any there's no feedback loop. Then you're not getting anything out of it. And then it truly is altruistic, which, by the way, then you get exhausted because you're putting all this energy in and not getting any energy back, and you'll stop doing it, right? And so, the ask to the community, or the thing to tell you guys would be reciprocal. What's the word? Reciprocal, thank you. The smart one over here. Reciprocal in the relationships. Make sure that you're giving first, but when you're taking from somebody, make sure that you then cycle back around, close those loops, and say thank you. And I think that helps with some of those problems.
But I think Stephanie's gone to worldviews very easily. And it's really hard to break out of it for all the reasons that Philip was saying, and we all understand. And I think, we are in a polarized economy, polity. How do we open up those lines of conversation? It's not easy.
That feel actually productive. That feel safe and productive,
Well,
and
yeah,
not
that's
just
you
entrenching.
can't just have ranting.
That's right.
Yeah.
That's right.
This is one of the big things that I've been talking about. Working on a grant called Intellectual Humility in Public Discourse. And one of the major recommendations that we have is to shift the frame of discussion from advocacy to explanation. So I didn't tell you about a study that we ran, but we do this kind of, like the example of the toilet with policy, right? We have other conditions where instead of asking people to explain mechanistically how it works, we ask people to tell us why they believe what they do.
That's fantastic.
And there you don't get the same kind of effects. You don't have increases in intellectual humility because people have this more of an advocacy kind of mindset. You say, this is how I feel about it. It's actually pretty easy to come up with reasons why. If I ask you, why do you believe in cap and trade? You say, because it's good for the environment. If I say, explain to me how cap and trade works, it's very different, right? So
Please don't ask me to. Right now in front of
don't draw a blank. But discourse that focuses on that kind of explanation, let's work together to try to understand this in a deeper way, has the effect of opening minds and moderating, having all those kind of beneficial effects.
These two things can coexist, right? So let's talk about Silicon Valley, pre-dot-com boom, in the heyday when we don't have any argument about there was a lot of give first and reciprocity and whatnot. At the same time, I was always struck that there was sort of, in terms of the worldview of a lot of the entrepreneurs, even though they were in this regional ecosystem, which they were clearly benefiting from, it was just hard to deny that their success was partly. They had and continue to have very libertarian worldview, which basically does not acknowledge any of the collective part of their success. They will claim individual, entrepreneurial success. I did it myself. And so it's a huge contradiction.
Yeah.
And yet, so they can be at the same time sharing information
hubris.
all the time. Yeah, maybe it's hubris. It's like, no self-examination whatsoever.
So I want to turn over for questions. We got about 12 minutes left, and
I'd like to talk.
want to make sure student goes first. So let's go for it. Got to be some, or I will call. Yep. Oop.
Joe.
into the conversation around technology, you know, and it's a big conversation now. I mean, everybody's talking about the feedback loops and living in your bubble. But how does that play a role in amplifying or, you know, quieting some people, bringing in knowledge into a community that's maybe not in the immediate area of that community? And then how do you define kind of good and bad outcomes, right? I mean, we kind of are coming from this at a mindset that knowledge sharing is creating good outcomes, but could there be situations where that knowledge is leading to a negative outcome, and how do you manage or prevent that?
I can give one example of how being inward-looking self-defeats. People remember Nokia, the cell phones. They were like the leaders. They were very early in designing a really cool interface. These little flip phones.
I'll never forget that damn ringtone.
Yeah, right. And
How does it go?
You asked.
That's what I was hoping you would do.
And they were technically way out in front for a moment, for about a decade and a half. They were way out in front, and one of the things that happened is that they essentially became locked into a worldview that was really about people they were from Finland. They had a strategy. They were going to scale up and do it, but they did not keep open their intellectual horizon. You know, innovation can happen anywhere. If you aren't always watching the external world and where it's happening, you're going to get blindsided, and they did. I mean, Google and Apple came along and did, you know, mobile internet, and Nokia just doesn't even exist or barely exists anymore. So give first within a closed community is very risky. In you know, technical competition. The other thing, obviously, we build all sorts of things that are killing the environment. They're succeeding in some purpose, but killing the environment. So being able to think at multiple levels about your impact is something we're not good at.
I mean, I think diligence to curiosity and trying to always be learning something new and questioning what you hear. I mean, we're not, I would love to have a rigor around that, which I do not. But I think that, I don't know, being curious about the world around you, going and learning about those things, and then when you learn, sharing them. I mean, some of the most interesting things that I've learned is because somebody else shared it with me. God, did you know how this works? And I learned about it. I'm like, wow, that's really cool. And so if you learn something that's interesting and you learn it, you know, factually, then maybe sharing it with your community. And the more that we do that, maybe we can try to break, you know, try to break down some of those walls. And I think the question on success or not, like, hey man, we're making this stuff as we go along, you know, like we're trying to do our best and figure it out, and we're going to get it wrong sometimes.
One thing to add is I think when someone expresses an opinion that's different from what you believe, we have two intuitions of where we go. Either A, they're an idiot, or B, they have bad intentions.
Or C, if you're a woman, oh shit, I was wrong. Exactly.
Usually,
yeah. Okay, I don't get this.
I mean, because you say, like, how could they possibly believe something that's incorrect, right? You know, like, I think the curiosity piece is really important. If you say to yourself, I actually going to assume this person's as smart as I am, and they're as moral as I am. What's the best version of the argument they have for their position? And that's a kind of curiosity I often have. You know, instead of reflexively saying, I don't want to believe that, you got to say, like, wouldn't it be sort of broadening to find out what the best version is of the argument? Sometimes you get the best version of the argument, it's the best version of a bad argument, but not always. Sometimes it actually expands your horizons. So that curiosity piece is really important.
In the open source space.
Yeah.
You brought up the cathedral, but you didn't bring up the bazaar
and
the open source world. And I'm surprised that didn't come into the cycle as a larger societal picture on Give First.
Well, I mean, in that article about the cathedral and the bazaar, who wrote it? I forgot the name of the guy that wrote it. Eric Raymond, thank you. I mean, he's comparing building software, right? And so the cathedral is the top-down building, and the open source is all the eyeballs everywhere, which is obviously a much more productive way to do some things. I think I would say Silicon Valley, if I want to consider it a bazaar rather than a cathedral, the environment where that model does well is when there's change, there's continuing change, and you have to continue to adapt. If the environment is stable, actually a top-down cathedral building works really well. So a lot depends on the context.
Yeah, I think the open source.
It's interesting, if you look at the evolution of open source, it's led to things like copyleft, which I would say isn't give first. It's the exact opposite of that, posing as that. And that's a whole nother Oprah for another day.
There's a question over here.
But it's interesting. I think it's, one of the first communities of give first probably was open source.
Yeah, and a good one.
Yeah, and a good one.
Kind of took my hand down. I worked in the open source community for the past decade, so I have a lot to say on that. So I'm glad you raised that. I actually think the cathedral and the bazaar analogy is kind of dead for a number of reasons. It's not really representative of the reality of most open source projects in today's world. But so what was I going to say now? I'd love to debate the concept of the comment you just made on copyleft, but I guess we'll save that for like another day. But I think I'm glad someone raised that, because when I saw this talk, I thought, this isn't new. This has been going on for years. And actually, when I gave a talk on collaboration beyond code, I kind of realized that, there's really nothing new about collaboration. But I think the things that I identified as for a motivation, I think there's a lot of themes here. Is that sort of like wanting to be, and an ethos that underlies open source, and why lots of other communities are trying to adopt that, whether or not it works, because it is sort of around copyright law as an underpinning of why it works in software. But is that like wanting to give to the greater good and see something, being part of a community and being able to build on something that you may have started or someone else started, and then see it become something better. And so I don't know why we have that motivation. I mean, we could get into the psychology of humans and something, but when I started thinking about that, I was like, oh, that has obviously been a major motivator for the things that I've done and the things that I've enjoyed and the accomplishments I've made in my career, and I wasn't thinking of it in terms of give first. Now I'm like a new thing, but I was thinking of it in terms of collaboration and harnessing that value that comes from collective knowledge, right? Like, we are much greater together than we are individually, and I'm not sure where that's not true, really. I mean, the cathedral was the closed source, limited people, as opposed to having a more collaborative model where more people can come in.
You can think about this in many contexts, right? I mean, there's still a debate in the world, I'm sure, about whether a system of sort of open, flexible markets versus, China, where it's top down. I mean, so it's not clear what kinds of collaboration can be done in many structures, institutional structures. And so I think the cathedral and the bazaar were two sort of metaphors for ways of organizing human labor differently. And the question is, is there another one? You're making it sound like that what really goes on in open source is something different altogether. So it'd be nice to know how you would describe that. I mean, of course, collaboration is not new. But we're trying to get at how humans organize their work to do something collectively that's bigger than themselves.
And I tend to agree, and I'm going way over my ski tips here because I don't know anything about biotech, but there are certain, when we say software, it's like, okay, that seems obvious. Open source is greater good, and we're all stronger together. And then you look at things that are heavily patented or stuff like that may not work that way. And I at least have the question in my mind. I'll go, I always, being on a panel with Phil is terrifying to actually make any proposition. I will just say I don't know what I'm talking about, but I know that I don't know what I'm talking about, but I do question whether there's some closed systems which are better in certain circumstances.
Well, it depends on the context. The legal context in biotech is really different than it is in software.
Massively. Way in the back. Oh, yeah, okay. Microphone coming your way.
Hi, my name is Nzambi, and my question is, in the philosophy of Give First, how do you scale the reciprocity? The reciprocity to an extent that you govern your expectation as a giver, and that way you are also able to guide and act as a catalyst for you to give more and also govern exploitation. So the question is, how do you scale the expectation of reciprocity? That one.
Yeah, I'll take that.
Go for it.
I don't think you do.
just going to say.
You don't go into it with an expectation of reciprocity. You just don't, because you don't really ever know where it's going to come from. You just open yourself up to giving and to being open to new experiences and meeting new people, and trust that the universe will respond, right? I think if you have an expectation on that, your expectation will likely be unmet, and then you will likely be disappointed. And so the best thing to do is stay open. My comment on reciprocity earlier was really around just, hey, like, this is how we can accelerate a Give First community, is by helping each other with that reciprocity. But I don't think you go into it with that expectation at all.
But at the same time, if the ecosystem doesn't show you reciprocity,
you
will burn
tire-
out,
you will
or
burn
the
out.
ecosystem will die. So I guess one of the ways to ask the question is, what can you do as a Give First individual to nudge it? And I will tell you from myself, when I spend time, specifically giving first, and somebody who's nice says, "What can I do for you?" And I'm like, "Help somebody else." And I will keep track and see if they have. Especially the students that it's 10 years now, going into 800 students, and a lot of them are thankful for the work that Bernthal and I do, and the answer is give back. And to this day, we've never had somebody say no, and a lot of them are proactive, doing things that we don't even know about and we hear. But you do have to nudge. I do think you have to set expectations that I'm not expecting anything from you, but I am expecting something from you in the greater good.
Yeah, there's one other thing.
Yeah, Brad?
I just want to reinforce Jason's comment, because it's really important in this thread, is I get asked, I'll personalize it, I get asked all the time by people, what can I do to help you? And that's an assignment. I'm already too busy, and I can't think of what they can do to help me. It turns out that saying to that person, find something in the ecosystem, in the startup community that is interesting to you and do it, is a way that helps me a lot, or helps Jason a lot. That's a default.
That's right.
That doesn't then put a burden on me. So again, think of it as philosophy rather than structure.
But there is a
idea of building this positive feedback loop.
And that's how it scales.
But there is a structure behind it, because there's something in communications called Metcalfe's law, and it's around when nodes become powerful in and of themselves, they create a self-sustaining structure, and they create a ton of NAD and connectivity. And so exactly what Brad was saying is, if you are also part of the giving, and you also encourage others to give, you also all of a sudden create the kind of foundational nodes that create a critical mass that is self-sustaining. I mean, it's that type of, again, I call it, I'm a telecom geek, so it's any connectivity around kind of mesh networking.
Network effects.
That's right.
It's
the network effects. We can be virtual in and eyes. That's what we'll call it. But
That's a friendly term, yeah. That's great.
You have to, there has to be a mechanism, maybe it's a nudge, to move beyond a bilateral reciprocal relationship, and extend it to other nodes and networks, and then it will self-perpetuate.
And then sometimes it shocks the hell out of you. I want to end on one thing of Give First. I mean, you spend years and years and years giving, expecting something to happen, but not sure what it is. And then one day, both Brad Bernthal and I have been subject to going to outings with our students, where we find that the students have raised endowed funds for us to do things. There's a Brad Bernthal scholarship. There is a Jason Mendelson Entrepreneurial Fund that these students got together and raised money. And something like that happens, and
Makes it all worth it.
you're like, well, I got the next decade figured out. I'm going to keep working really hard. And you never, ever forget that. And it comes back in surprising ways. And you just keep reminding people to keep giving back. And sometimes even your wildest dreams are exceeded. With that, we're done. I'd like to thank the panel very much. We've got I've been told to tell you that we have a 15-minute break. Anna Niskezi, 4 o'clock. Okay.
This is a lot of fun.
Are you guys going to? Are you leaving? Yeah, will you be there? Yeah, it would be fun to continue.
I gotta go take my kids to ice hockey.
Okay, yeah, take them to ice hockey. So nice to be with you. Yeah, that was very fun.
Yeah, I will not be there.
Oh, too bad. Yeah. So you're Office of Economic Development for the state? Yes.
I work for the government, yeah.
Good for you.
But I was in technology for 30 years.
Yeah, I You have the expertise.